Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this ACTA webinar. I'm going to be the facilitator today. My name's Nick Zeps. I have worked quite a bit with ACTA over the years. I was one of the founding directors, and I currently chair a number of the working groups. I'm currently involved in clinical trial activities, both through my role as Director of Research at Northern Health and also at Monash University as the Director of Operations of the Clinical Cancer Registries, the Quality Registries. So my role today is really to facilitate what I hope will be a very enlightening, interesting series of discussions that our very accomplished panelists are going to provide to you. Jono's taken my brief of a fireside chat rather literally, and so he's provided the flames. Hopefully there's no real flames at this time of year, respecting all the bushfire warnings. We do have a number of people. I'm just waiting. We've got 107 people so far logging in or thereabouts, but we have got quite a number of people expected today who will be joining us. We've got about an hour and a half scheduled for this, and we'll see how that time frame goes. We don't really have too many formal presentations, just a couple of oversights, but what we will hopefully have plenty of time for is some panel questions. So we'll be encouraging you to do that, and I'll go back through how we're going to run that shortly. But first, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today. And for me in Melbourne, that is the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. Thank you. So we've got a couple of guidance slides here. We can see the background. So I'm just letting you know that this webinar is being recorded, so hopefully everyone is okay with that. It allows us then to make it available after this event, and we'll provide some additional resources on the website when we present it. We've disabled the chat function for the purposes of using the Q&A function, which we find more efficient and effective for finding out the questions. So please do use that. In my role, I'll be reading those, and I'll be working with Amanda just to make sure that we can get those so we can work through as many as possible. If your questions weren't answered, don't dismay. We'll try to get some of those answered by our panelists, or we'll provide responses afterwards. We would like you, I know it's always difficult to fill in these very short surveys after these meetings, but it does help us with planning and with designing these to get a bit of feedback from you. So we really would appreciate it if you would spend just a couple of moments of your time filling in those responses. I'd like to certainly acknowledge Joe, who has done a huge amount of the work to setting this up, and all the ACTA team right from the outset. We wouldn't have been able to do this without them, and certainly without Joe's coordination and good humor in bringing us all together. So thank you, Joe, for that. And if we just pop into the next, we'll provide this afterwards, but we really are very grateful to our participating organisations as part of the Australian Teletrial program and the Regional Clinical Trial Coordinating Centre's activities. The Teletrial program is enormously dependent on this. It's a real world leader, and we just sort of highlight that if you do want to reach out to your respective states and territories, these are the contact details, and again we'll make these available to everyone after the event. So if we just then I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers, and then I will cease my witterings, but hopefully we've got Kaye online. I don't see her yet. She is good. Kaye, if you can sort of make yourself known, because we have a couple of formal presentations, which will be relatively short, just to set the scene. I'm very grateful for Kaye taking time to join us today from the Australian Teletrial program, and she will provide an overview. Then we have Naomi Sprigg, who's the Clinical Operations Manager at the Australian Leukaemia and Lymphoma Group, which again, with a huge amount of experience in operating clinical trials and really overseeing a very vibrant trials group who have experience in this area. We have Gabrielle Byars, who's the CEO of Melanoma and Skin Cancer Trials, MASC, and again, lots and lots, several decades of experience in working in clinical research across multi-center studies. And again, we have this common thread of people who have had living experience of running these kinds of trials, and that, I think that's going to be really important. Jonathon, who prefers to go by Jono, or people know him as Jono, again, enormously experienced person who's come through the Clinical Trial Centre at NHMRC, CTC, sorry, and has worked in both industry and in other organisations. Really very important wealth of background in a number of clinical areas, and not just in oncology, so neonatal, perinatal, and kidney health trials as well. And last but not least, in the initial forum, Kelly Foran, who's a RRR consumer representative on the ACTA Teletrial Project Working Group. And I think, we are enormously grateful, and we are in our own work constantly informed by the participation of consumer groups and consumers who give very selflessly of their time to making sure that the work we do is directly aimed at serving the best interests of the community. And this, what we often have now become more comfortable in using in the terminology of co-design, is really about that bi-directional participation, where the consumer input is seen as very much part of the engagement and participation to make sure that clinical trials are serving the best interests of the community, who they're intended to, the outcomes of the trials are intended to improve the welfare of all of the community. So each of them has a brief bio, which we'll put up in the show notes at the end, and you can read, and we'll provide their contact details so that you can reach out to them directly. With that, those series of introductions, if Kaye, who we were able to spend a little bit more time together at the Teletrial Forum that was held in Adelaide last week, and I was very grateful for the opportunity to facilitate that meeting. We have a really wonderful federally funded program, and I will leave it to Kaye to say some words about the program.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me, Nick?
I can.
Okay. I can't seem to put my camera on, so I'm really sorry about that. We just had a bit of a session trying to get me onto there, so apologies for that. I am very proud to be on this webinar today, and very proud of the association we have with ACTA as well, which is proving to be a really collaborative and progressive relationship, in terms of we all bring different skill sets together, and we're all very much committed to this idea of taking clinical trials closer to patients. All I really wanted to say, and if we could go to the next slide, that would be great, is just to kind of reiterate again that this is a grant, maybe once in a lifetime. We're hoping not, but maybe it is. So we have to make the absolute most of it. And it's an infrastructure grant. So the biggest part of that infrastructure was in establishing these regional clinical trial coordinating centres across the 6 jurisdictions. And with that has come a level of expertise around clinical trials and teletrials implementation, which is now available to their health services and primary healthcare, including, and acute care services, and associated health giving services, so public, private as well, to utilise that as a resource. What we learned very quickly as well was that there was a number of tools that were available already out through the pilot, which was the Queensland pilot that went from Victoria and Queensland. So a number of documents had been developed, supported by COSA, and they were all readily available at the beginning. But as our experience has grown and we've grown, in knowledge around implementation, that's starting to take on a really sort of, these supporting pillars are essential to the program as well. So working very collaboratively across all of the jurisdictions and including other teletrialists who are Revitalise and Alfred Trial Hub, to name two of the most probably significant that people would be aware of in Victoria, on policy harmonisation and streamlining and standardising some of those policy and templates, etc., to support this. And some of you probably have seen recently and been consulted around the supervision template, which covers the model, and I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. The other one, of course, is that the RCCC are very clued into needing to educate and build a workforce in the capacity building side of it. So we have got some online modules available now through AC Tech, but importantly as well, they're on site educators, if you like, to go into those health services as well and keep building that capability and making sure that the staff are well equipped to provide patient support through their teletrial program. Not all states, but most have some equipment funding and are looking at the logistics of resourcing that around, and the challenging part of moving out of metro areas and moving IMP around is something we are tackling again as a nation, if you like, and we will be making some recommendations and building some guidelines around that. And again, built on the experience that we're seeing as we go more regionally and remotely. I won't talk about the teletrial recruitment boosting because I'm going to talk about the actual model, but this whole program is underpinned by strong governance, and we have a supporting evaluation impact assessments going on as well through JCU and OSHI QUT in Queensland. If we could go to the next slide, I think this is the one you're most interested in. So the model, well, ATP works through a teletrial being a clinical trial that has clusters of satellite clinical sites. I'm going to intermittently just use some different language here for a minute because we talk about primary and satellite, and how people interpret that is really critical to how they might engage and buy into the model. So we've done some work with consumers, and we've been talking more what's in the media at the moment around what does a satellite mean. And consumers were very keen to understand this as a coordinating site, and that they're bringing and having local sites closer to home. And I think that's really the key. It's local sites that deliver the same level of care, that are equipped through that education and training, that have the skills, have the relationship with patients and their key clinicians to be able to keep their patients in their communities with their support networks. Now, we also understand that not every clinical trial or teletrial can be run the same way. It might depend on the clinical specialty, but it also depends on the level of what's available at that site. So for some things, the patient may still have to go to that coordinating site to access, maybe because it's got a higher level of technology, for example, an MRI, but it also might be that the satellite site is taking a little bit longer to set up, and they need to, for the first or second treatment, go to that primary site to access that. The lead clinician at the primary site is referred to as the principal investigator, is responsible for the trial and the recruiting the participants, overseeing the participants' consent process. So really they're the supervising specialist who is going to support the satellite site associate investigators, but also, I guess, through regular communication, which is the tele part, is through regular communication, provide that oversight and supervision to those satellite local sites. And any number of satellite sites can be added to a teletrial cluster with the agreement of, in the commercial sponsor space of those, but in collaborative clinical trial space, usually it's through that network of the clinical specialty that is set up in that way. There are other people on this call who are far more expert than I am in this space, so that's just an overview, and they are available to help answer questions. But we're really happy to be part of this today and to hear the other presentations.
Lovely. Thank you, Kaye. That's a really neat overview of what has actually been an enormous body of work for many years. So thank you for that. Now, Naomi is going to give us an oversight, and I think this is going to be a useful sort of starting point to open up some of the discussion. Naomi, if I could hand over straight to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting us along today. So I've got myself here, and I've got Shivani, who is our lead trial startup go-to, who's fantastic and has a wealth of knowledge. So I've brought her along today. So I just really wanted to highlight, so if we go to the next slide, why we do teletrial models. And one of the primary reasons is that 29% of the population live in rural and remote areas across Australia. Rural Australians, we know, experience poorer health outcomes there. We often have the areas there with service capabilities that vary, and as was just mentioned in the previous presentation, you know, not those satellite sites, the teletrial sites may not have, you know, access to the PETs and things like that, which is why we use the primary site there for those. So less than 5% of regional patients we know participate actually in clinical trials. So we want to overcome the perception of lack or missed opportunity there and get it out to those patients in that demographic. We know there's that discrepancy in health outcomes with the metro versus regional. The teletrial model is really facilitating a resolution to that there. So we want to improve what we're already doing and do it better, and particularly for that rural and regional community. So we're implementing the novel trial delivery models with a focus on teletrials for all our new trials that are coming into ALLG. Next slide, please. So what we do at the start of a trial, and Shivani does this, is that we send out feasibility to all of our ALLG members at all of our sites across Australia and New Zealand. So that reaches over 92 hospitals. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what we're at now. And that e-survey will then provide us with feedback from the members about the trial. So we want those sites to let us know parameters around what patients they believe might be able to be recruited to the trial, the expected timelines for that recruitment, is the site aware of any competing trials and things like that, any limiting factors against standard of care. You know, access is really important, access to the protocol-defined treatments, any study-specific tests as well. So again, as we were just mentioning about the PET, you know, the patient might have to or may be able to just have bloods done locally, and then only at a minimum amount of times head to the primary site for a test that isn't done at that local site. So so our teletrial, we always do it as well, just to highlight the supervision plan, which is key for the flow, and that really explicitly details and provides clarity between that primary site and the teletrial site, and that's usually written with the sponsor and with the site as well. Next slide, please. So this is just some learnings that we've taken, and as you can see, there's some of those things Kaye's already mentioned about for the drug distribution, for example. We find with our trials that we've been running, we've got quite a few in the rural and regional areas that also are utilising perhaps, you know, the oral meds that are easier than perhaps, you know, those trials that might need inpatient stays for inpatient admissions, I guess is what I'm saying here. Regarding the database access now is much easier today with our ECRF platform. So that means there's no limitation there to that teletrial site in accessing that. The same with our pharmacovigilance. So our SAEs can all now be done electronically, and emailed through and things like that. So adding satellite sites, it can be a little bit time consuming, I'm guessing, but it's really facilitating the trial across a bigger population that would otherwise not perhaps have been able to participate in a clinical trial. I just wanted to highlight the risks and benefits here, which some of those we've already touched on. So improved access for patients living in rural and regional areas, improved access and recruitment for rare cancers, increased participation in our clinical trials across Australia and New Zealand. We want to see reduced burden of the trial participants, and that can be, even, travel time, social disruption, with themselves, friends, family, and the cost as well of that. So I think that's really important to consider. So successful trial recruitment for the purposes of the study. So we want that to ensure the safe conduct and the risk assessment and utilise the resources for models of support. So at ALLG, we've, the teletrial model has been formalised from the more informal satellite site description that we used to previously use. And now we have that increased reach, increased opportunity for our members to be engaged across the different hospital sites in Australia and New Zealand, and most importantly, the increased opportunities for patients with the blood cancers. So I guess I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. So all clinical trials in Australia are good trials, but the test is not who's running it, but is the clinical trial a good fit for the patient and their type of disease? What is the trial testing and how is the trial conducted, and what are the implications here? So just to highlight here about a patient story we have who participated in a clinical trial of ALLG, which was a CML trial, and recently celebrated his 70th birthday thanks to the treatment that he did receive on one of our clinical trials. And I think our next slide just highlights that as well, that reach, why we have clinical trials to patients. And this again is another patient participated in another ALLG clinical trial. They're essential to improve treatments for patients, improve our medical knowledge, and for how to make a difference here. So, so we just want to be providing that access for patients to the new treatment and improving our knowledge, and hopefully we can change the practice in doing so to improve outcomes for patients.
Thank you. So thanks for that presentation. I think that gives a really important perspective on the value of running not only trials, but making sure that they have the widest reach. I'm just going to sort of open it up now. And Gabby, we've had a bit of a discussion about, some of the benefits of doing the trials. What's been your experience?
Yeah, I think there's clear benefits, especially for us in terms of the incidence of skin cancer in Queensland. And Naomi sort of picks up on quite a few things that have lent themselves to some of the trials that are in our clinical trial portfolio. So, for instance, Merkel cell carcinoma, we're running a few trials in that area. And the incidence of Merkel cell carcinoma is the highest in Queensland, particularly high in Australia and New Zealand. And so we've been able to use the teletrial model for a couple of different instances across Queensland, where we've had very experienced sort of primary sites that have been supported by, the PI. It allows, I guess, regional site coordinators to get support through training at the primary site. but importantly, it sort of increases access, which for Merkel cell carcinoma is particularly important because it fits under that umbrella that Naomi mentioned of a rare cancer. It also allows people to get, you know, the trial treatments closer to home, which is really, really important. For instance, we've had a patient who has presented at our ASM and is on our website, John Mason, who actually is in regional Bundaberg. And, you know, I think he spent close to a decade sort of, you know, living on a yacht, spent a lot of time in the sun, 3 different parts of Queensland and in the Northern Territory, and then, you know, thought that his little spot would be sort of removed and recovery would be fairly smooth, but that wasn't the case, as he sort of found out. And his clinician, Dr. Wenzu, who is actually leading the IMAT trial, which is one of the trials that we've got in our portfolio that's looking at the combination of avelumab plus adjuvant or definitive radiotherapy. And so it sort of allows patients to receive that therapy closer to home. And that particularly was the case for John. He sort of mentioned to us that he was quite impressed that, you know, he had those trial options or those treatment options so close to him, and that he felt more secure and that he wasn't having to add, you know, trips to Brisbane on top of that pressure and uncertainty that he was suddenly sort of placed in.
Thank you, Gabby. Kelly, I think this sort of is a logical spin to you. I mean, obviously, we've just heard a few examples of, you know, the potential benefits of the teletrial model. What's been your experience? And I'd love to hear your comments about it.
I think, Nick, as the girls were saying, if it can be made easier, and having the teletrials sounds amazing. My experience was we wanted to be part of a trial, but it just to begin with, when we first started, we tried to get bloods and we weren't supported with that, which was difficult. And the following time it was the same. You know, we thought we had it all organised and it was the same issue. And then we did travel sort of 2.5 hours for the next time that we sort of wanted to participate. And then after that, it all was just too hard for Dad. So he just wanted to be part of something. And, you know, his cancer diagnosis, he certainly didn't want it to be for nothing, and he wanted to help and support. He was part of the Mark Hughes Foundation and certainly had his brain harvested for that, and we supported what we could there. But and I believe there's a lot of people who would feel that way. So I think, you know, the easier we can make it, and these teletrials and things are just, is amazing. I'm very excited.
So I think that really does speak to the accessibility. I mean, obviously, traveling, you have to travel to main centres to get certain types of treatment, but the capability of being able to have the trial or even parts of the trial delivered locally to avoid some of those issues is really important. Jono, I was going to swing to you. I mean, in your experience, you're working and you've worked extensively in the clinical trial sector. What have you seen as the both the good and the bad in terms of the accessibility? And happy for you to take a comment about how you'd fix it if you were in charge of things.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think thanks, Kelly, for chipping in there with that perspective. I've seen a couple of other workshops and things like that around the teletrial space, and a couple of consumer perspectives, and that travel time, it certainly does come up a lot, and we obviously want to reduce that. And, you know, when we hear from research nurses and we hear from PIs, it's really all about what's best for the patients, and I think everybody wants to get on board with that. And so anything that we can do to make things easier for patients, that's obviously ideal. On the flip side of that, there's also There's also some risk from a sponsor perspective. If you've got some participants that are having to travel so far every day, you've got some increased risk of attrition there. So certainly it's in the sponsor's interest to bring the trials to participants as well. But another benefit of teletrials, which we don't often hear talked about, and this is related to my foray into teletrials in my capacity as a sort of site manager, operations coordinator on trials called Beat Calci. It's a investigator-led platform adaptive randomized trial in a rare disease. And so by implementing teletrials, it can be, and is certainly our intention, is a good way of reaching an expanded population base for a disease with a relatively low incidence across all of Australia and New Zealand. And so by trying to bring the trial to regional and remote areas can be a big advantage in the rare disease space as well.
So I'm going to come back to you, Naomi, because a couple of things you said in your presentation, which I thought were really interesting, is about firstly your accreditation or knowing that the sites were ready for the clinical for doing teletrials, and so you spoke about that, but also the fact that you had integrated the teletrial model into the trial protocol. And I think we've heard a lot of conversations about people who've sort of bolted on the teletrial afterward and some of the complications that can create. I'd love your perspective about the accreditation and the integration.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll actually let Shivani, who's the expert here, talk about that. So once we have our concept from our investigators, we develop it up, and once that protocol is approved there, or even at that time, actually, we're starting to talk about the teletrials into the sites. So I might let Shivani speak.
Yes, so at the time of the initial feasibility, sorry, can you hear me well?
Yeah, if you can sit a bit closer, that might be better.
So we actually do a pre-feasibility as well as the development time frame when the protocol is being developed. So it's kind of the message that is being sent out. It's not necessarily in like a clear wording at the moment in the protocol, but that's something is the next step that we are implementing in our future trials. But that's a conversation we sort of start with all our trials, the sites that we get in touch with to get that interest, feasibility sort of at the development stage. And then once the protocol is formalized, then also at the site selection stages, where we sort of clearly ask those questions that Naomi mentioned in her presentation as well. So I think the effort here that we're trying to put in is to educate the sites as well. I think a lot of sites still do not know that we can actually reach out to those rural and regional centers. So there are a lot of our participating sites that are accredited sites that we work with. They still do not know that they have that opportunity to sort of reach out to their cluster that is not cluster. I think that would be confusing, but they have this group of sites that they already work with as like regional sites, but they do not know that they can access and provide the trial access to those sites as well. So that is sort of an effort at the moment that is really we sort of really focused on. Do you want to add anything else apart from that, Naomi?
Yeah, so I think a good example is one of our big lymphoma trials that's sitting with Shivani at the moment. For example, we were aiming to get 20 sites participating in this trial. Our feasibility came back with 26 sites, or 29 sites, 27 sites that wanted to participate in this trial. And these were metro and rural regional sites. So what we did, because we wanted to give this opportunity so valuable to the patient population here, is that we then, which is what we're talking about now, we've set up primary sites with teletrial sites off them. So there's, one site in New South Wales, Queensland, that has 3 sites coming off that primary site. So the more and more we put it into our trials, it's just a routine thing that we do now. And I guess, as Shivani was mentioning, we're educating our members as well. And that's our investigators at sites, but also our study coordinators at sites, and the trial managers at sites as well, that this can be done. And I think we're doing it better now. The supervision plan, you know, perhaps at some point, you know, maybe even 12, 24 months ago might have been looked at a little bit burdensome perhaps to get going, but we now have that template that's been established and in place, and it's a lot smoother, and it's really not burdensome or anything like that as it may have been at some point. Yeah, so I think it's really fantastic, and it's really, you know, getting the drugs, you know, the access to patients, you know, and obviously there's some trials that we really can't perhaps, you know, make this work right now, and that might be mainly sitting in the primarily for us, the AML trials, but for, you know, lymphomas and, you know, CMLs and, you know, a lot of other diseases. There's different people here on this call that work in different disease areas, so don't need to go through them, but you know, especially the oral medications are an easy one to get out there in the greater population.
And I would like to just quickly add, sorry, Nick. So having that question clearly defined in our feasibility surveys actually give us a lot of opportunity to have that open communication with the site. Excuse me, I've got a bad hay fever, sorry about that. So with that open communication, as Naomi said, it takes a lot of time for us to sort of set up, but then it clarifies a lot of things for the sites and to establish that process. And I guess that's kind of forming part of the education as well with the sites and the CIs. And I think a lot of the pharma companies are also getting very interested, and they have been very supportive of the model as well. So because as we all know that the IP has to be, you know, delivered or has to be accessed at those satellite sites. So those kind of factors really at the early on when we discuss with the pharma companies and the development stages really help as well to set up and establish that smooth process.
So I think what's really important to sort of bring out here as well is that we're at ACTA and all of the members, because it's a membership organization, that the people, and I sort of looked at who was in attendance today. I think one of the things here, a theme that's emerging, is that as one group or more than one group goes through and provides that level of support at those satellite sites and builds the confidence, that the next group coming through can capitalize on that. They benefit from the experience that has already been built up. So it is standing on the shoulders of giants, I think, is the expression that Newton once used, which was, you know, how does he see further? And I think this is really where we want to get to. But Kelly, I'm going to come back to you, because one thing I wanted to pick up on, and it's about the trial design itself. It was said to me many years ago that the best way of understanding how to design a research project was to put yourself in the shoes of a patient and walk through the hospital as though you were the person experiencing it, and, you know, in the fortunate sense that you didn't have the condition that they had, but to put yourself very much in what would be expected if you were to walk that through. And I think, Kelly, the question here is, we talk about this co-design. How do we design clinical trials that incorporate the kinds of things that would create barriers and incorporate some of that thinking into the teletrial design? Have you some thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose with Dad, with my dad's sort of the experience with him, making sure, you know, the down to the trial that, you know, you weren't going for additional blood tests, or you weren't going for additional appointments, trying to do a coordination of those sorts of things with the doctor, with the staff, with the nurse, with everybody, you know, making sure it was well coordinated. And I suppose the biggest deal for Dad was the travel, which, you know, and that's also the experience that we had when Dad first got sick, which he just started saying some really bizarre things. My dad was a 73-year-old, the fittest man you've ever known. You know, so when we first started, things were, of course we could do that. You know, of course we could probably duck down to Newcastle, you know, 7 hours away, and, things like that. But as the tumour progressed, you know, obviously even an hour in the car was too much, and then it got to the point we couldn't even move Dad. He was completely bedbound for the last 6 weeks. So I suppose it's being able to have a trial that's robust enough that can roll with those punches, you know, so that if at a certain point when Dad couldn't make those appointments, could the appointments come to Dad, you know, with the trial or with a nurse? I know that's probably pie in the sky. You know, we don't have enough nurses even to sit in our hospitals, never alone be in a car and go out. But, you know, maybe those sorts of things, because Dad's dying wish was to give back. And lots of people are like that. You know, we all want to give back. We all want to make what's happening to us have a positive, at least a small positive. So if we can try and do those sorts of things, and I suppose even down to, I know, Nick, this sounds probably quite silly, but even where the trial's going to be at in the hospital, make it easy, because, you know, I know Dad's head was a little bit off, and he wanted to be independent, but he couldn't find where to go because it was a little bit hard. So I know that sounds silly and very basic stuff, but sometimes I think we just have to think basic.
Yeah, not at all. When I started work at a hospital just recently, it took me many weeks to orient myself around to find where various departments are. And I know it can be very difficult. We also know from work that was done in West Australia many years ago with the Cancer Council and others, asking patients what their biggest challenges were, and it was car parking was, you know, amongst the top of the list. And
absolutely,
you know, we worry sometimes about the complexity. Oh, it's going to be this trial and that, and it's actually some of the most mundane elements. Gabby, and then I'll come to you, Jono. Gabby, just in terms of that facilitation, you know, we know that we have to comply with a lot of bureaucracy, and that there's obviously the requirements of GCP, the good clinical practice. The regulators want everything documented. At the risk of prompting you, have we made it all a bit too hard?
Well, I think we've got some great examples of how smooth and easy it can be. So Queensland particularly have done a really fantastic job under the ATP model. And just with, you know, some good framework and some staff capacity in terms of knowing and understanding the process, and some great examples, it is actually really easy, and it's much quicker, for instance, than setting up a primary site, which is sort of ultimately the best thing for the patient. We're seeing more and more changes. For instance, some ethics committees will actually not charge if there's a small amendment related to a satellite site, which is a really good thing to see. A lot of what we are working with in Queensland particularly are very experienced teletrial coordinators that are just sort of really taking care of the whole process, and the facilitation and the attention to detail, for instance, has made it quite easy for us to set up a couple of different examples in the IMAT trial that I mentioned, both within Queensland but in different groups. So for instance, that has made it a very smooth process, and particularly with, you know, things like rarer cancer or rarer trial population, it's not necessarily any more work for the primary site, because you're staggering recruitment and you're actually sort of looking for different patients at different times. So it just depends on how your screening is set up at site. So yeah, so I think there's some great examples out there. We have a little ways to go in Victoria and New South Wales, I think. You could say that in some other states, it's actually taking just as long to open a teletrial site as it is as a primary site. So we've got some ways to go in terms of improvements there.
Well, it's good to learn from other sites wherever possible. I mean, I always like to go and visit the Sunshine Coast or Noosa for learning. as you can imagine, in the cold winters of Victoria. But I think there is something to be said about learning from as many sites as we possibly can. Jono, there's a question about how much initial investment is required to set these up at sites and capabilities. I mean, there is to some extent, it's how long's a piece of string. But there is that question, as Gabby was saying then, about what resourcing is required, and have we got it right in terms of sharing the resources with the satellite sites versus the amount that gets paid to the main site?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Nick. I'll first echo Gabby's compliments to Queensland and how well they've rolled everything out. I don't know what's in the water up there, but that's where our sort of main forays into teletrials have been to date. We are relatively new in the teletrial space ourselves as the sponsor, so we thought that we would go where the models are working really well up there, and a couple of the LHDs and the teletrial clusters that we're working with up there have described to me how helpful the RGOs are. The HRECs are on board and familiar with teletrials at this point. The QRCCC, I understand, has recently brought on board a governance specialist. I think that might be true. I heard that, and you know, if that's the case, that's fantastic. Obviously, to help sort of navigate these governance processes, and again, the teletrial coordinators, as Gabby said, are very knowledgeable, very experienced, and provide so much support to these clusters. In terms of the initial investment to be laid out for a primary site or sort of a teletrials cluster, in a non-Queensland setting, it might be a little bit more challenging, and being in the non-oncology space, as we are in kidney health, a lot of the clinical trial units that we work with in a relative sense may have a little bit less clinical trials infrastructure compared to, say, hematology oncology units, maybe a little bit less sort of, I think baseline infrastructure is probably a fair way of saying it. No disrespect meant, of course, but then you know, trying to add teletrials on top of that, it does add a little bit of a layer of extra complexity, and something that we may need to work through over time. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about sort of how rollouts are going in the other states, New South Wales, Victoria, and maybe state-specific barriers that they're facing there. Certainly. Well, I'll just sort of welcome any additional questions from our colleagues online. Please do use the Q&A. We've had a few. We're sort of very keen to hear from you also. Apologies for not being able to ask live questions. When we've got such a large number of people, it is rather difficult to manage. But certainly, Victoria, we've got two Victorian groups here, but maybe, Naomi, if I throw to you and Shivani, just, you know, what has been the experience in Victoria in this, or New South Wales?
Yeah, so we've had experience of a recent satellite site set up.
Yeah, can you just lean in a little bit more? It's a bit hard to hear you at times. Sorry.
Is that better?
A little bit better, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So we've just recently, not recently, I think just a couple of months back, we have added the teletrial component onto an existing trial. So that was 2 Victorian sites, and it was actually a really smooth process. And I think with a lot of training and support available, especially through the VCCC and the Department of Health doing all the trainings and the online trainings that have been available, I think, especially in Victorian sites, I think there is a lot of education already going around and awareness amongst the site staff as well. No, if I think about any sort of barriers or challenges, so far, no. Yes, having said that, every trial would probably have like a different sort of learning. So we're setting up with the New South Wales cluster right now. So they were pretty quick with the supervision plan. So I think, but what the challenge that I saw with that particular trial was the initial feasibility. There were a lot of questions from those New South Wales sites about what is this, how we will do it, and they were sort of they were not sure how they would sort of resource it around. But then eventually, when all the questions were addressed, I think they were pretty comfortable doing the teletrial, and now we are actually really progressing well. So I think with that, lot of education and these sort of seminars and webinars happening, I think it's getting more serious if I talk about setting up trials at ALLG and our experience with it, it's been very smooth, and plus with the monetary side of it as well, our CCCs and the additional funding really helps with being investigator-led trials for us as well as a collaborative group. The main concern comes around is the budget, but now that we have additional funding, that really also adds on as a big help.
Yeah, thank you. So I suppose one of the things here as well that we're wanting to encourage amongst this community that's in attendance is knowing where to find information when you need it. So ACTA will be providing some guidance material. That's what we see as the role, is to provide some additional information or even navigation to areas where resources. We certainly don't want to be duplicating any of those resources, and there are a number of extremely good resources available, and making sure that people are aware of those so that they can utilize them. One of the earlier questions was about, the cost modeling. Well, we'll be able to provide some advice, and it's one of the outputs of this project that we're going to be working on. Similarly, we've got a couple of questions here. One of them has been about considerations for patient-reported outcome measures. So using EPROMs and various things of that nature. I'm presuming that obviously can be done remotely, because if it's delivered as an EPROM, it can be done in a remote way. There's a question also about the barriers because of ethics committees and having a variety of different approaches. I think that's something that you've commented on us before, and I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up, but the variance amongst practice and the variance in charging. I had a very interesting conversation this morning with a good friend and colleague from New Zealand who sort of indicated that there might be some questions raised because they're not able to charge for ethics review because it would be anti-competitive and monopolistic, because it's just one organization doing it because they've got a centralized ethics, which raises some interesting questions about standardization and whether or not it's actually appropriate to charge publicly funded clinical trials for reviewing them. So forcing them to be reviewed and then charging them fees. But, that's some fighting talk that I can put out there, see if anyone agrees. But I think that those are the kinds of, we've got some questions around the academic trial sponsors and the investigator-led trials, not just the commercial. So, it's the factors around doing trials, and Kelly, just coming to you, I mean, some of the trials that we're looking at are not necessarily to register a new product, but to examine whether a combination or a mechanism of delivery is better and leads to better outcomes, or even dose modification to see whether, particularly in the palliative care setting, that you can still treat people effectively even where there may not be an intention of a cure or a miracle to occur. I suppose, to what extent is that really well understood, Kelly, that clinical trials can have different intentions in the community?
I don't think it's understood at all, to be honest. And even my experience from telling people I sit on sort of clinical trials and conviction the group, a lot of people were, number one, couldn't understand what I was talking about. But I even said, there's clinical trials for prosthetics. There's clinical trials for all sorts of things. And and I said, if we didn't have clinical trials, you wouldn't have penicillin, and they sort of went, oh, well, we hadn't thought of that. So I think, we really need to get it out there that, it's not just, as you say, for a cure, it's for everything. And I don't know how we do, Nick. I don't know how we get it out there in rural, remote, regional, other than banging on about it. But I think soon as we peel back the onion and people then go, wow, I'd be part of that. I'd want to help do that. And so I think exactly, people think clinical trials think, oh, you're just trying to find a cure, end of story, and move on. So we have to really push that through, I think, that it's everything.
So Kelly, I might Valerie Yee put a question that we've answered, but to some extent she's raised this a similar point. You know, the first foray of a satellite site might be in something that is less complicated to some extent, an observational study. I mean, there are teletrials, or there are trials that we are running about care pathways.
Yeah.
And what is and some of these involve delivery of digital health services in the community. So those, you can have trials where you randomize people between coming into the hospital or actually receiving the care in a telehealth environment. So a trial for a teletrial.
Absolutely. And, you know, again, if people, we just have to get the word out there, because, you know, and I suppose that's why I sit on a lot of different boards, is trying to get across, you know, how much better off we'd be at home if people could, you know, if we had telehealth, or we had someone who could support us in having someone at home. So I believe if we get that across to people, that it's about all those things, that many more people would jump aboard and want to help.
So on that, we've had a question. I'll throw it open to anyone who feels that they want to respond to this, but it sort of speaks more broadly to risk. So what additional insurance indemnity might teletrials require? And I suppose there's this question of, well, what's the risk if it's an observational study versus a full interventional study? But it's about risk management. Has that come up as an issue in the experiences that you've had?
Myself, no.
No. Sure. And
yeah.
Any of the trialists, have they?
Yeah, I think it can just depend on the nature of the trial. And usually that can be a discussion between the site, it might be the primary site, and the sponsor or the collaborative group that is assisting you. It's generally something that has not been a burden or a hurdle for us. I don't know how Naomi feels.
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. There's no change or effect to, I guess, you know, our insurance for ALLG. But from a site perspective, the CTRA, perhaps?
Yeah, they do put a lot of detail in there and specifications. And as we said, that it will, again, it depends on the trial, but we haven't had any particular instance where we haven't seen any challenge in terms of the insurance. So I agree with you on that point.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't want to say anything to Kelly because she's in a car, but I was going to say that one of the riskiest things you can do is get in a car in your day. That's one of the largest risks you'll ever take on. And driving to the hospital is almost more risky than some of the things that might occur to you in the hospital. So we've got to have something that has a proportionality to it. Jono, have you got a perspective on that as a sponsor? Has that cropped up? Is that something that...
In terms of the
insurance and indemnity and contracts?
Yeah, no, we haven't run into anything like that thus far, Nick. So far we're just looking to use sort of Medicines Australia CTRAs, but then yeah, I mean, as we noted, I guess it may be a little bit different from the site's perspective. I mean, because according to the sort of chain of responsibility, so to speak, a lot of the sort of responsibility actually falls on the primary site as opposed to on the sponsor. I mean, obviously the sponsor has the overall responsibility, but according to the Teletrials model, a primary site has, I guess, increased responsibility relative to what they might normally have if they have, you know, 2, 3, 4 satellite sites. Then that may be something that is looked at sort of at the local level between the primary and satellite sites.
And risk management is really what governance is in the end. I mean, a lot of people talk about research governance as though it is some miraculous, new system, but in effect, it is risk management. And it's how do we do that? Now, Naomi, you've got your hand raised, please.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to mention, we often with our satellite sites, and we've done this recently with a couple of trials, is we've teamed up the primary site with a teletrial site who they already go to the primary site, and it might be for MDM meetings. So for example, at Royal Melbourne Hospital, we would have regular MDM meetings with, you know, Albury Wodonga, and then for Royal North Shore, who do they have? COF? Is it COF maybe? Yeah, so we're sort of already, some of those collaborations with the primary site and the teletrial sites, some of that relationship already exists. So I guess we're, you know, nurturing that relationship away in a way in that we're then building on that, and we're, you know, trying to get that site then who's already going to the primary site, you know, with MDMs and things like that, and then acting as a teletrial site.
Right. Now, just mindful of the time, and I know this is a really important discussion. We can extend as we need, but I'm just going to sort of aim to finish around 4:15. So I've got a couple of last questions, but e-consent has been raised. I'm a big fan. I think there's been a lot of misunderstandings about what we mean by e-consent. It isn't just an electronic consent form, but it's the whole pathway. Have you had an experience? Anyone experienced use of e-consent? Gabby?
Yes, we have, and I think both with the use of e-consent and e-proms, which can really help sites, particularly, you know, it can change their follow-up mechanism. So, for instance, you can plan an e-prom reminder just prior to their visit. So it's one less thing that you have to do within your site visit, for instance. Yes, definitely. I think, and we facilitate that through RedCat, for instance, which is a database that a lot of trial groups use. And I just very briefly wanted to touch on your other point, Nick, about the importance of regional sites. You know, when you're looking at things like, you know, health economics and cost effectiveness and the burden on the healthcare system, it's really important that if we're trying to demonstrate a change in delivery or, you know, suggest that one mechanism might be better than the other, we just have to make sure that it's not just metropolitan sites that works with, and that regional sites, for instance, in cities, actually get adequate representation in a lot of these trials.
Great, thank you. So we've got Joel Ernest has asked a question about encouraging primary sites to drive the adoption of teletrials. And I suppose to some extent that's the purpose of this webinar itself, is to sort of say to the clinical trial networks, the groups that are coming up with the clinical trials, you've got to be able to design a trial and have an intention to run a teletrial as part of a trial. We should be calling it trials and teletrials, as the National Compendium sort of articulates, that it's there from the outset. Kaye, I'm sorry, we've got a picture of you now, so that's very nice to see. I was going to just pop you on the spot, if you don't mind, but it really is, this is an important question. In the experiences that you've had now working in this teletrial environment, have you seen a transition in the way people are thinking about teletrials, rather than thinking, oh, we better sort of add in a couple of extra bits about doing a teletrial, rather than thinking of it being a teletrial right from the outset, and integration?
Yes, I guess, especially as we're kind of merging out of the oncology space into more other clinical specialties. I think the premise is that we're trying to be aware of what our site capabilities are through the RCCCs, and them to work with those sites very quickly to say, you know, are you interested in this as a teletrial participating? In Queensland particularly, they have deployed people, as you know, across the state, and they have regular networking. In some of the other states, WA is fast getting up to speed with having done their first one, to kind of like probably have a bit more of a fly in, fly out type approach to their workforce to be able to pick sites and work with those sites. Victoria, again, slightly different, but, you know, building that maturity across the region, so it's not just dependent on metro to region, but can go region to region and further out through their hubs. So yes, and also where there hasn't been any, of sharing that experience of first setting up a primary site and a satellite, and then swapping quite quickly, so that they're having different experiences across different clinical specialties to get that experience as well. And of course, we do have some financial reward for that as well, so it helps them to do that quite quickly. But again, I would emphasize the role of the RCCCs here in knowing their sites and the capability and the staff there, and being able to, through the startup specialists particularly, go to those sites and work with them very quickly to see, bringing them up to speed, but also see that they are ready to be part of a cluster.
Excellent. So it certainly helps if there's a financial incentive there also, and that we reduce the barriers. So it definitely sticks and carrots. I'm going to start the pathway now to wind up, but I've got Jono with his hand up. So be very keen to start with you, and then we'll sort of work our way around the room, and you can say your final thoughts about teletrials and what you want our audience, the actor audience, to take home from this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. I suppose some of the key takeaways that I would like to deliver is that teletrials, I mean, it's in the best interest of patients. We believe it's in the best interest of consumers. We know that PIs, we know that sites are keen, we know that research nurses are keen, we know that sponsors are keen. So this is an initiative that is beneficial on many sides to many different stakeholders. So the momentum, I guess, is with us in that sense. And of course, we have a lot of support from the ATP. And so over time, we look forward to seeing more capacity development and skills development as teletrials is adopted more and more. And hopefully we see, as I said, more sort of adoption across more defined clusters. We spoke about some clusters that work together often, and that, so I expect that we'll see some more of that. And speaking to some teletrial coordinators with the RCCCs, it's sort of their impression that this will sort of diffuse with increasing prevalence over time. So looking forward to seeing that.
Thank you. I'll just go around now. I've got Gabby, and then I'll come around.
So I think being able to finesse some of those, I guess, procedures and approaches in some states where we've got an excellent model in Queensland would be great. I think it's partly, as Naomi mentioned, educating our members that it's actually really good to involve regional trial sites, and it really does improve access. We've even been able to incorporate, reimbursement, for instance, for regional patients within some of our grant applications. And I guess just promote how smooth the process really can be for some of our investigators, really sort of trying to demonstrate that. More adoption, essentially.
Absolutely. Thank you. Naomi and Shivani?
Yeah, thanks. I think, look, I mean, we absolutely want more and more teletrial sites to be participating and patients to be participating from rural and regional areas across Australia. I think we can, we're only improving on our processes to get that access out there. If there's any members on the call here who would like any information or, think that their site might be someone who might, a site that might want to participate, please reach out to myself or Shivani here, and we can definitely help with that, and we can help with other resources as well. Yeah, that would be fantastic.
All right.
I just wanted to, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to sort of say that it does sound a bit challenging at the start, and so it was for us as well. But I think the more you sort of get into it, it gets smoother. So don't be scared, I'm afraid. I would just say to everybody, and as Naomi said, we have resources, we can handhold the sites, take you through the process, develop those supervision plans with you, and work through the contract. So it's not as tricky or challenging as it sort of maybe sounds like. But yes, we understand the resourcing might be a big issue at the sites, but we are there to help if there's any trials that we are collaborating with. So there can be shared workload also. That's an option, just to promote that teletrial component of the trial.
Okay, thank you. And yes, and certainly ATP provides lots of resources and templates and plans and all sorts of things to support sites. I'm going to finish with Kelly, and then I'll do a brief wrap up.
I think probably for me, education. I think you guys have got the hard job. And I think consumers just need to be more educated, and communication, you know, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbours, talk about telehealth, talk about teletrials, talk about trials, you know, and those sorts of things. I think, you know, I love to think that the world is such a beautiful place that everybody does want to help. And I think you'll be surprised if people feel they can jump aboard, if it's quite streamlined, if they're supported. I think we'll get lots more people sort of wanting to help and jumping aboard.
Thank you. And what a great way to finish this webinar. I think that is a call to arms. It's to share our knowledge as a community. The ACTA community is one of all the clinical trial networks and the coordinating centres and indeed clinical quality registries. So we really want to bring everyone together. I would just flag that we've got the International Symposium next week. I hope as many of you are going to be in attendance as is possible. We do look forward to welcoming you to Melbourne. We promise to put on some reasonable weather, but if you wait a while, it will probably change anyway, so don't worry about that. We're going to provide we've recorded this, we will provide it onto the website. There will be resources on the ACTA website. We've got a working group that's meeting at the ACTA meeting that are going to be developing further work in close alliance with the ATP and RRRs and others. And we're very grateful for their investment in us and the work that we do with them. We certainly want you to fill in the post-webinar survey. If you could, please just take a couple of moments out of your day. It's very important to us just to get that feedback, and hopefully it'll shape the nature of these webinars. As ever, I think we've heard from a wonderful array of people who've got the experience in this field. We're going to get better at this. It'll be the dream in a few years that we don't talk about teletrials as being anything other than business as usual. So this is really where we want to get to. So with that, I'm going to thank you all very much for your attendance. I'm going to thank the ACTA team, and in particular, again, to acknowledge Joe's role in coordinating this and putting things together. Joe and I have worked together I was trying to put a date on it, but it's a long time. So longer than we probably care to remember. But thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again at one of these or in person shortly. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks,
Thank
Nick.
you.
Thanks, Joe.